It was funny, Travis actually had asked me to preach before this last week, but he and his family took a trip to Iowa to go visit Nicole, his wife's new nephew. And they had a 6-hour drive, and by the time they had all made it to Iowa, I'm not even kidding, all 4 family members of the Roberts family were sick, okay? London and Emma both came down with influenza, or I think Emma came down with influenza A, and London had strep throat or something like that. And then Travis and Nicole both came down with fevers of their own. So the flu is taking over half of Wichita and the entire Roberts family. Pray for me and Nicole that we don't come down with the same thing. But it's cool though that Travis had already planned on having me preach because he was in no shape at all to preach. So this thing's falling apart on me. Let's do this. So let me pray for us, and then we will roll right on in here. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for who you are, for being the kind of God that you are. Lord, you are not always the easiest to understand. That's definitely true. We've all gone through situations where we just didn't understand what was happening. We didn't understand what you wanted us to do, why you wanted us to do it. But one thing is for sure, you are above it all. Like the scriptures say, you are holy. And you're wise, and you see everything before it happens, and you know what should happen, when it should happen. Father, I just pray right now, as hard as it is for us to wrap our minds around it, I just pray that you'd help us to just be okay with the fact that you are God. Help us to be still and know that you are the creator of the universe, that you have things under control, even when things aren't super convenient for us. You are a good God. You're a father to us all, even those of us who feel so far from you. Lord, we thank you so much for who you are, Lord, and for sending your son Jesus into the world, not to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen. So, following the Lord is great while it's convenient. But what about when it's not convenient? And you guys know what I mean? If you've been following the Lord for very long, you know that there are certain seasons when it's convenient and easy because it falls within your plans. But then sometimes when it doesn't fall within your own plans, within your own willpower, within your own timing, and that's when following the Lord is not easy. David is a man committed to following the Lord and seeing through the plans of the Lord. That's one thing that I hope you guys see as we are getting into the life of David, all these stories about David, that even though he's not a perfect guy, just like all of us, nobody's perfect. And David made a lot of mistakes, and we still have yet to get to some of his biggest goof-ups. But he was a man who was he was committed to doing what the Lord wanted him to do. He was committed to seeing through the plans of God, even when it didn't make any sense to him. And that's going to become even more clear with the story that we're going to hear today. He's a great example of a man in history who allowed God's heart to guide his own. And that's the theme of this whole series, is the heart of man, how God's heart changes mine. And last week we talked about how David, when he was facing extreme opposition from Saul, he chose not to fight, but to turn and run, which, to our world, that's just silliness. Why would you be a man and fight? He turns and he runs away. And in his desperation and when the pressure was on him, Travis last week talked about how David changed his behavior and he made some mistakes. He didn't totally trust God in those moments. But while he's on the run, David is assisted by Ahimelech, the priest at Nob. Okay, you guys remember this part of the story? The priest at Nob gives David and his men the holy bread. the bread that was reserved only for priests and only for holy situations. But the priest gives David and his men this food so that they can get their energy back. And he also gives David the sword of Goliath, the champion that David killed and cut off his head. He gives him this sword. So Ahimelech does David a huge favor. He helps him out and he sends him on his way. And a few days later, Saul finds out that Ahimelech has assisted David. Okay, this is the part of the story Travis didn't talk about last week. So Saul finds out that David was assisted by Ahimelech, and Saul gathers Ahimelech and all these other priests. There were 85 priests that Saul gathered together. A crowd of about this size, maybe just a little bit smaller, of people that he gathered, and their families. And Saul scolded them. He said, that's my enemy. Why did you help him? And this is one of those times that you can really see how committed Saul is to his own plans. We've talked about how David was really committed to seeing through the plans of God, even when he didn't understand them. But Saul was committed to carrying out his plans. Like, whether they were right or wrong, he knew what he wanted to do and he was going to carry them through. So Saul is just mad. And he says to his men, you, step up and kill these priests. And the first guy who gives this order to him, he's like, wait, you want me to kill the priests? These are the holy anointed people that serve the Lord. Like, I can't do that. Like, he steps away and literally cannot do it. But then Doeg, the personal assistant to King Saul, steps up and takes out a sword, and he murders 85 unarmed priests and their families. All of them dead. And you can see how nothing will stop Saul. His rage. He's using the power that God gave him to be king to carry out his rage. Sometimes we do the same thing. God's given us a lot of power, a lot of influence. He puts us in situations where we can make decisions that will either help or harm people. But Saul, as you can see in this story, he uses the power that God gives him and he carries out his rage. Saul was committed to seeing his own plans through. He continues to pursue David. All right, and at this point, Saul has gathered a troop of 3,000 guys, and he is committed to finding David. All right, it's a huge search party, and it's starting to pay off. Because Saul actually catches up with David, okay? And Saul actually finds himself wandering into the very cave where David and his men were hiding. All of those men and all of that time, they made up all this time, they closed the gap, and now Saul is standing in the same cave as David, only Saul doesn't know it. In 1 Samuel chapter 24, I'll start reading in verse 1 of 24. When Saul returned from following the Philistines, he was told, behold, David is in the wilderness of En-Gedi. Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men out of all Israel and went to seek David and his men in front of the wild goats' rocks. And he came to the sheepfolds by the way, where there was a cave, and Saul went in to relieve himself. Now David and his men were sitting in the innermost parts of the cave. And the men of David said to him, here is the day of which the Lord said to you, behold, I will give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it seems good to you. David's men are like, David, there's Saul. David, let's kill this guy. Here's your chance. Like, God has clearly given you an opportunity to kill your enemy. Say what you want about whether murder is right or wrong. This guy's got it coming, David. So that his men are encouraging him. Think about it. Saul is the one who literally started everything with this whole situation by trying to pin David to a wall with his spear. Okay? Saul has just used his power and authority to murder 85 priests and their families. Saul is using his rage, his hatred, his anger to destroy anybody who's standing in his way. And here is David's opportunity that you could say God put into David's hands. to finally get a little bit of revenge against this guy and be done with the threat. And with one swoop of his sword, he could end the threat on his own life and become the most powerful man in the kingdom. Can you imagine the temptation? I mean, Saul's standing with his back to David in the darkness of a cave. David could swing his sword, cut off his head just like he did Goliath, and take his head out and show them to Saul's men. And the whole thing could just be over right there. Only something weird happens. If you keep reading chapter 24, verse 4, he says, "Then David arose and stealthily cut off a corner of Saul's robe. And afterward, David's heart struck him, because he had cut off a corner of Saul's robe. He said to his men, 'The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to put out my hand against him, seeing he is the Lord's anointed.' So David persuaded his men with these words and did not permit them to attack Saul. And Saul rose up and left the cave and went on his way." Lets him just walk right out of the cave. But then David does something even crazier. Verse 8, "Afterward David also arose, went out of the cave, and called after Saul, 'My lord the king!' And when Saul looked behind him, David bowed with his face to the earth and paid him homage. And David said to Saul, 'Why do you listen to the words of men who say, Behold, David seeks your harm? Behold, this day your eyes have seen how the Lord gave you today into my hand in the cave. And some told me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not put out my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. See, my father, see the corner of your robe in my hand? For by the fact that I cut off the corner of your robe and did not kill you, you may know and see that there is no wrong or treason in my hands. I have not sinned against you, though you hunt my life to take it. May the Lord judge between me and you. May the Lord avenge me against you. But my hand shall not be against you.'" Really interesting move, David. Verse 5 says that David's heart struck him. And the New Living Translation literally says that David's conscience got to him while he was about to act against Saul. Have you ever been in a situation like that before? Have you ever been in a situation where you're getting ready to do something, and maybe you were in the exact same situation as David, where you had an opportunity to get vengeance on the person who struck you first? Have you ever been there? Or maybe it was something else, maybe something that you just knew that you weren't supposed to do, but then your heart strikes you. Have you ever had your heart strike you like that before? I believe that's something that happens when we begin to allow God to have influence on our hearts. When God's heart starts to change your heart, you'll feel it strike you. You'll be in a situation that you know isn't right, and you'll feel that. You'll be like, what was that? And you'll know it's not right. David was able to completely saturate his thoughts and his heart with the voice of God. The voice that spoke inside of David's chest, that spoke to his heart, that spoke through his thoughts, was the voice of God. And here's something that you find really interesting in this passage. When you take the time to listen for God's voice, God's way becomes clear. I'm going to say that again. When you take the time to listen for God's voice, God's way becomes clear. Now, God's way is always hard. Like when people talk about knowing God's will, it's really hard. God's way is not always that clear. But one thing that I have learned is when you take the time to search the scriptures, when you take the time to pray, when you take the time to seek wise counsel, to really give God an opportunity to speak to you, the way becomes clearer, or the way becomes clear to you about what you should do. And David is an example of someone whose heart was saturated with God's voice. David had allowed God's heart to mold his own, so that he even came to the point of caring about everything that God cared about. You see that? Even this low-life murderer had no business caring about this guy anymore. He's been trying to kill him. Why would he care? But because he had allowed God to mold his own heart, to care about the things of God, all of a sudden he's starting to care about his enemy. God's voice was in David's head, and he was whispering, "Mercy. Show Saul mercy. Vengeance belongs to me, David. Be merciful." These verses tell us that God handed Saul over to David. Like, that's what the men were saying. God has clearly handed him over to you. This is an act of God. And isn't that kind of funny? Like, if you think about it, God puts us all in situations like this all the time. Like I just asked you, can you think of a time or a place where God handed an enemy over to you? Where you had the opportunity to strike someone down who struck you first? I can remember a time. I can remember several times, probably, like if I take the time to really remember. But I remember this one summer, I was working at a camp called Camp Oriole in northwest Arkansas. Anybody ever heard of that before? No? Okay. Oh, there we go, one person. So it was a really cool summer camp. Kids from all ages and all walks of life really came to this summer camp. It was a cool summer camp because the camp somehow worked with parents and people from different backgrounds, like lower income families. They gave them deals so that their kids could come to this camp. It was really cool. You had kids from all kinds of walks of life come and hang out with us for a whole week. And I was the camp counselor of the 7-year-old cabin. All right? You guys, anybody know any 7-year-olds in here? 7-year-olds can be really fun. I actually really love 7-year-olds, but they are very, very trying. So there was this one 7-year-old who loved when I would grab him and throw him up like that. And I did it to a lot of them, but this kid loved it. All right? He would find me from like all across the camp, and I'm really easy to find. I'm 6'4", really skinny and tall. Like, oh, there he is. And he would just run up to me, and I would do it all day long. I'd get so tired at the end of the day because I did it so many times with this kid. And I think I can't remember his name. I think it was Tony. We'll just call him Tony. But we were in the cafeteria, and I was just throwing him and putting him down and picking him up and throwing him. And we were getting in the line to get our meals. And we're going through the line, and inside this cafeteria, it's kind of old school, but there were like these giant, you guys know like when you're in a building and there are big steel braces, I guess, is what I don't know anything about construction, I don't know what those are called. But there's big steel, beams, basically, and they go up and they arch. Well, we're getting close to this steel beam, and I'm still throwing him up in the air, and I take little Tony, and I throw him up, and I bash his head on the steel beam, okay? Okay, so in this story, I kind of deserve this. But Tony doesn't think for a second. He rips back and slugs me in the face, like punches me. I'm like, what the heck just happened? Like him, he was like, you had that coming. But I'm like frozen there for a second. I'm like, did that just happen to this kid? Like he punched me. He didn't like push me or like this little 7-year-old slugs me in the face. And I'm sitting there and I'm holding him like this because I'm still holding him. And I have to like put him down. And I like get down on Tony's level and I'm just like, Tony, like, oh gosh. I don't know what happened. I don't know how I was able to do this. But I was like, Tony, look, dude, I'm so sorry that I just did that. I know that your head hurts. I know that your head hurts. I'm sorry that I did that, but you cannot slug me in the face, man. You can't do that. Somehow, something within me stopped me from wanting to just, A camp counselor later, he was like, dude, I don't know if I would have done the same thing. I don't know how you were able to, like slow yourself down. But in the moment, I was somehow able to see him as who he was, just a little child who didn't know any better. Like, honestly, I hurt the kid pretty bad. Like, I know he probably had a raspberry the size of Texas on his head. So he was just acting the way that he knew to act. But I was able to see him as he was, just a child who didn't know any better. And I think that in this story, this is kind of the way that David was able to view Saul. David was able to view Saul as a child who didn't know any better. He was able to view Saul as a child of God, whom God really, really cared about. You hear the number of times that David says that Saul is the Lord's anointed. Isn't that crazy, by the way? Like, Like, God anointed David king. If nothing else, he could have used that to kill Saul. Well, God anointed me king, so your time's done. But David trusted that there was still a purpose here for Saul. He was still able to trust that even though Saul was trying to murder him. In a sense, that's the way that we have to view people in similar situations. As children that God is using. See, David entrusted Saul's destiny to God. David entrusted Saul's destiny to God. And that's a hard thing to do. To do nothing right after someone does something, to start something with you, to just let something go, to let go of maybe several offenses. Have you been in a situation like that, though? Someone who's hurt you intentionally over and over and over falls into your hands. You finally have your chance to strike. Maybe not like David, not with a sword, but maybe even with your words. There was this pastor that I worked with. His name was Tony Almslecker. And he had a lot of influence on me. And he would always use this terminology. He would say that when people hurt you, sometimes you take their offenses and you keep them and you put them in a quiver on your back. Okay? Sounds kind of strange, but he would say that if somebody ever offended you, you would take their offense and you would use it as a dart. And you would just hold on to it to maybe try to use to injure them later as a weapon. You guys know what I'm talking about? He would say that if somebody hurt your feelings, like, for example, a friend at work said something and maybe they were just trying to be lighthearted, but it really offended you, like it really hurt your feelings, and they later on, they realized the error of their ways and they apologized to you, or maybe they didn't apologize. Either way, you held on to it and you put it in that little quiver, and the next time they hurt your feelings, you brought it out and you throw it at them and you say, remember when you did this? Do you remember? And some of us are good at that. Some of us are really good at just trying to remember the things that people have done to us. And we count them. We count them on our hands and we keep them in our quivers and we take them out whenever it's convenient for us and we throw them at people to try to injure them. The Apostle Paul would call that keeping a record of wrongs. He would call that keeping a record of wrongs in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 5, when he's describing love. And he says, look, love never keeps a record of wrongs. But keeping track of other people's offenses against us gives us some control. It gives you power. If you can remember how people have hurt you, you can use that against them later. You can remind them. And at this point in the story, David's got this great opportunity to injure his enemy. I mean, he's got plenty of reasons why he could totally use his sword to just end it for Saul right now. Only he doesn't. Somehow, David is able to hand Saul over to God. Now, this takes a power that none of us probably can really truly understand. Max Lucado, in his book, Facing Your Giants, he says that David was able to route his thoughts about Saul through heaven. Isn't that cool? That David was able to route his thoughts about